I have always believed that the past is never truly buried, that it lingers in dusty files and forgotten ledgers waiting for the right eyes to uncover its quiet rot. And when I walked into the municipal archive for the first time, it did not feel like an ordinary job but a calling, because I already knew that the secrets I sought were in those endless rows of paper coffins, and those secrets were mine to exhume. I was not a stranger to secrets nor to revenge, and if you've heard my confession before, you already know how blood has trailed behind me like a second shadow. Yet the truth is that what I did then was only the beginning, a prologue to the deeper corruption I sensed but had not yet named, and the archive was where those threads converged. I learned quickly how to move like a ghost through those stacks, how to touch brittle paper without leaving a trace, how to copy quietly and replace carefully, and while the other clerks thought me shy or aloof, I was studying the mechanics of silence, because silence is the greatest weapon of an archivist. Each night I took pieces home, stitching fragments into a tapestry of deceit, a picture of judges and businessmen and police officers, and at the center always the same figure, Judge Nathaniel Harrow, a man whose rulings had shaped half the city and whose name was whispered like some distant monarch, but on paper in my hands he was reduced to ink and contradiction. The first time I saw his signature attached to the wrongful commitment of a boy no older than my brother had been, I felt the old wound stir, the one carved when Matthew's life was stolen. And I realized that Harrow was not simply a judge but an architect of ruin, his pen as lethal as a blade, his verdicts weaving a net that pulled down the innocent and enriched the corrupt. That discovery did not ignite me in rage, it cooled me into focus, because I understood that revenge is not fire but ice, patient and preserving, and every page I collected was another shard for the spear I would eventually plunge into him. I learned his routines not from following him in the streets but from the documents he signed, from the schedules he maintained, from the correspondence he thought lost in forgotten folders, and through the archive I became intimate with the rhythm of his life, knowing when he traveled, when he lunched, when he buried decisions in bureaucratic jargon. I did not speak of my findings to anyone, for an archivist speaks only to the dead and to herself, and in those endless silent hours I whispered to Matthew as though he could hear me, promising that his death was not in vain, that the chain of men who had broken us would one day choke on their own secrets. When Harrow presided over cases involving missing evidence, I could trace the vanishing documents back to names in our archive index, and I realized then that he had tentacles within the system, clerks who removed files, officers who forged notes, and yet his mistake was arrogance, for he believed the archive a forgotten mausoleum, never imagining that someone like me would treat it as a battlefield. There were nights I stayed long past closing, walking the aisles with only the hum of the lights above me, and in that solitude I began to think of the archive as my cathedral, each file a reliquary, each box a tomb, and I its lone priestess officiating at a sacrament of remembrance and vengeance. I was meticulous, recording his involvement in land seizures, in wrongful commitments, in concealed deaths that had been ruled accidents, and each new fragment was another stitch in the shroud I was weaving for him, though no one but me could yet see its shape. When I finally looked up from my notes and realized that a year had passed, I felt both the weight of obsession and the clarity of destiny, for Harrow's name appeared too often, too boldly, as though daring me to confront him, and I knew the time for silent collection was ending. Still, I did not rush for revenge that is hurried is easily broken, so I began mapping not only his corruption but his private life, using every leaked schedule, every receipt, every forgotten letter, until I knew his favorite restaurant, his mistress's apartment, the hour his driver took smoke breaks, and with this knowledge I felt the balance tip. The city saw him as untouchable, robed in authority, but in my notes he was naked, reduced to habit and weakness, and I began to imagine the precise stage upon which I would strip him of his last illusion of power. One evening, while sorting through mislabeled files, I found a sealed folder marked with the initials of my brother's case, and within it lay the final confirmation, a memo signed by Harrow himself ordering the suppression of exculpatory evidence, and as I read his cold language my hands did not tremble, because I had long suspected this truth, and suspicion is a quiet fire that prepares you for the burn of certainty. That night I did not sleep but instead walked the city streets until dawn, seeing in every reflection of glass his face, his thin lips, his calculating eyes. And I resolved that his end would not come in a courtroom nor in the press but in the same silence he had relied upon all his life, the silence of closed rooms and locked doors. I began rehearsing as if for a performance every step from the moment I would approach him to the final second when breath would leave his body, because a flawless act requires rehearsal, and I was not merely his accuser, I was his executioner. It was not difficult to secure a temporary position as a records consultant in his office because forged credentials and a quiet demeanor are more convincing than bold lies, and soon I found myself walking the same corridors as his aides, my presence blending with the wallpaper, my access expanding with each nod of trust. Harrow himself rarely noticed me, for men like him never see the archivist, only the verdict, and that blindness was his undoing. Because I moved in his shadow, cataloging his personal files, memorizing the placement of his safe, the rhythm of his comings and goings. I marked the day when his driver would be absent, when his mistress was out of town, when his meetings ended early, and I chose that evening because the silence would be complete, the stage cleared of distractions, leaving only him and me in the archive of his sins. He returned to his office at dusk, carrying a briefcase stuffed with papers, unaware that I had already disabled the cameras, unaware that I stood behind the curtains waiting. And when he finally looked up and saw me, he frowned as though trying to place a familiar but distant face. I spoke first, reminding him of a case long ago, of a boy named Matthew whose life had been written off with a stroke of his pen, and as I spoke his expression shifted from confusion to recognition, then to disdain, and that disdain was all the permission I needed. The weapon I carried was not flashy, not dramatic, but a simple blade, sharp and silent, chosen not for spectacle but for certainty. And when I stepped forward, his words faltered, his authority dissolved, and for the first time Judge Nathaniel Harrow looked like a man confronted by truth. I told him that every file I had gathered was his true biography, that his legacy was not the rulings in law books but the ruins in human lives, and as his eyes widened, I pressed the blade into his chest with the same calm precision I had used to press ink upon paper. He gasped, tried to form words, but I silenced him with the cold assurance that his name would never again be spoken in reverence, only in whispers of corruption and blood, and when he collapsed against his desk, I felt no elation, only the quiet completion of an inevitable script. I did not rush away, for haste leaves footprints, but instead I arranged the room as though he had been working late, the blood hidden beneath layers of papers, the silence intact, the stage set for the discovery that would come only in the morning. Walking out into the night, I carried nothing but the memory of his face, and though the city lights glared above me, I felt cloaked in darkness, unseen, untouched, a shadow returning to her cathedral of secrets. I whispered to Matthew again, telling him that another link in the chain had been severed, that the archive of our pain had claimed another soul, and that I would not stop until every page was accounted for, every ledger balanced. And as I vanished into the night, I realized that I had become more than a sister, more than an archivist, more than even an avenger. I had become the embodiment of the silence itself, the silence that swallows corrupt men whole, leaving nothing but a footnote in the margins of history.